So there's a lot of talk right now about racism, but it seems pretty clear to me that people are conflating group bias with racism. Now, racism is a particular bias against a race of people because of their race. Group bias is a bias against a particular group of people because of observed patterns of behavior. So, for example, if I approach a group of black men in business suits in a business area, my assumption is about that group are going to be different than if I approached a group of tattooed black men in gangster attire in the inner city. We all know this, and we know that this is not racism. Racism would be if I were to treat both of these groups poorly simply because they are black. This group bias, or what we more commonly call stereotyping, is different from racism because it doesn't really have to do with the race of the people involved, but rather the observed patterns of behavior within a particular group, regardless of their race. For instance, if I approached a group of white men in gangster attire in a trailer park, I probably would treat them with much more caution than I would a group of black businessmen standing outside of an office building. We all belong to different groups, and we discriminate against different groups based on patterns of behavior. In fact, sometimes it can work to people's advantages. So, for instance, if anyone has ever worked in landscaping, they know that people with Latino-sounding names are probably more likely to get hired than people with white-sounding names because there's a stereotype that Latinos are harder working in manual labor than a lot of white people. In addition, we all know the old stereotype about the black kids getting picked first for the sports teams. Now, this is messy business. This isn't a good thing. In an ideal world, everyone would simply be judged as an individual and not based on their group identity, much as Dr. King talked about. And I fully support working towards that as much as possible. However, life is complex. Let's take an example. Let's say you have a 5-year-old daughter and you need a babysitter. You have a young man in your neighborhood who's a teenager, and he offers babysitting services. You also have a young woman in your neighborhood who also offers babysitting services. You don't know either of them very well, but they both come from basically identical backgrounds and have essentially an identical resume. However, you know that the young teenage boy is 10 times more likely to sexually abuse a young girl than a young woman is. So should you take that into account when you're deciding who's going to be watching your daughter? Now put yourself in the shoes of the young man, okay? He just got rejected by every person he offered to babysit for because they made assumptions about him because of his gender. In fact, young men almost rarely even offer babysitting services to people outside of immediate family for this very reason. It's not fair for this young man, as you know, let's say he never would sexually abuse a little girl. But the reality is that when push comes to shove, people are trying to analyze risks and costs, and they will take measures they believe will reduce risks and costs. And sadly, this is the plight for many young black males. Young black males make up 3 to 4% of the US population, yet they account for half of the murders and robberies. Employers sadly take this into account when they're hiring employees. It's not fair to the innocent black men, and we should do all we can to reduce this tendency. But before you're too harsh on the employer, keep in mind that you likely do the same thing when hiring babysitters, and no one calls you a sexist. It's easy to judge others and tell them what to do when you don't bear any of the consequences of the decision. It's a complicated problem. So how big of a problem is this? You know, some put out the narrative that, you know, literally this sort of group bias is exactly what is destroying the black community, keeping them oppressed, all the rest of it. But that is not what the data seems to say. You know, it isn't the primary driver of the high crime rates and poverty that give the black community a poor reputation. The black community in the US in 2020 stands apart from any other community in human history. In human history, with a staggering, never before seen in history, single parenthood rate of 70%. I cannot underestimate what this means and why it is the best explanation for the vast vast majority of the challenges the Black community faces. And the reason why is because regardless of race, the following things are true. 90% of runaways come from single parent homes. A teen is 5 times more likely to commit suicide when they come from a single parent home. 71% of teen pregnancies come from single parent homes. 85% of children with behavioral disorders come from single parent homes. 71% of high school dropouts come from single parent homes. 85% of youth in prison come from single parent homes. Single parent children are twice as likely to drop out of high school, twice as likely to end up in jail, and they're 4 times more likely to need help for emotional or behavioral problems. These are according to the CDC, the Department of Health and Human Services, the National Principals Association report, and the U.S. Department of Justice. So, in conclusion, while group bias may be a problem, it should be obvious to anyone with common sense that what is going on and why all the privileges afforded, and that Black kids are not going to have the same privileges afforded to them as white kids when so many, the majority of Black kids are being born into homes of single mothers. Having mass protests over group bias in this case is like having a passionate argument about energy efficient windows when the house is burning down. And if you think the Black family was destroyed because of racism, I'd highly encourage you to read Thomas Sowell, who completely destroys this false narrative.